Hi, boys and girls. It's Mrs. Hendrickson. Today we're going to be talking about Lesson 4, Colonial Life. We're going to cover some vocabulary such as slave trade, apprentice, growth rate, great awakening, and backcountry. We're going to be talking about why different people groups came to America. So, Section A is called Why They Came. Living conditions in Europe during the 1700s were miserable for many people. Some fled wars or food shortages in their homelands to settle in the English colonies. They were drawn by the promise of cheap land, economic opportunity, and religious freedom. So, those were three of the reasons why people came: for land, for opportunity, and for religious freedom. All right. The dangerous journey across the Atlantic Ocean took between 2 and 3 months. It was a terrible time for those aboard a ship. The ships were crowded, damp, and filthy. Storms sank many vessels. Ships often ran out of food and water. Diseases spread quickly and killed many of the people on ships sailing to the colonies from Europe. Captives and servants. Conditions for African captives were even more dreadful. Every part of the slave trade, or the business of buying and selling people, was designed to bring profits to the traders. On ships, captives were chained together and crammed into spaces where they could barely sit up. 1 out of 7 captives died from disease, starvation, or poor treatment during the journey. And boys and girls, there's a photograph, and the caption says, "Enslaved Africans were crowded into the holds of slave ships." Now we're going to talk about indentured servants. Indentured servants were people who chose to come to the colonies but could not pay their way. They contracted or agreed to work for a colonist, usually for 5 to 7 years, to repay the price of the voyage. Indentured servants also received food, clothing, and shelter in return for their work. However, their living conditions were often harsh, and their work, especially in the fields, was difficult. When their contracts ended, indentured servants often received farmland, animals, and supplies of lumber and tools. So if you see the difference there between the slave trade versus indentured servants, African captives were not given the option of earning their freedom or working toward their freedom. They were forced to come to America. They did not choose to come. The indentured servants chose to come. They just couldn't afford to pay for the ship ride over or to get started once they got here. So they worked to pay off that the money they had borrowed for the ship ticket. And then they were usually given farmland or things to get started once they had worked for 5 to 7 years. Section B, daily life. Most colonial families worked on farms. Men planted crops and hunted. Women did household work such as cooking, gardening, sewing, cleaning, spinning, and weaving. Children did chores such as feeding chickens, milking cows, gathering eggs, and cleaning. When they were not helping at home or studying, children played with marbles, kites, and jump ropes. Learning a trade. To learn a skill, a young person could become an apprentice. An apprentice is someone who works for a skilled person and in exchange learns a trade or a craft. After studying and practicing, an apprentice might become a silversmith, printer, or barrel maker, for example. Apprentices were not paid, but they received meals and housing while they learned their trade. At first, only boys were allowed to be apprentices. After 1647, girls became apprentices in such trades as printing. So like printing newspapers or I guess like little books and things like that. Early communities. Colonists often combined work with play. An entire community, for example, would gather together to build a house for a newly married couple. Examples of other community activities were corn husking competitions and quilting bees. At quilting bees, neighbors sewed together pieces of cloth to make a bedspread or a big blanket. The colonies grow and change. Trade along the Atlantic coast led to population growth in the colonies. The population growth rate from 1700 to 1750 was about 450%. So that meant more and more people were coming all the time to America. The growth rate is a year-to-year change expressed as a percentage. Philadelphia was the largest city in the colonies. By 1750, it had grown to almost 20,000 people. Benjamin Franklin did much to help the city grow. He established the first fire department and public library. Franklin also improved the city's police department and postal system. Religion changes. Religion also changed in the colonies during the 1700s. Growing interest in religion led to a period known as the Great Awakening. Preachers such as Jonathan Edwards and George Whitefield spread their message with a dramatic and emotional style. The more dramatic the sermon, the more people attended. During the Great Awakening, less formal church services taught that all people should have religious experiences. During this time, many people changed from Puritanism to other forms of worship. For example, some Puritans became Baptist or Methodist. Some New England Baptist groups welcomed enslaved Africans at their church meetings. And Section C, Life on the Frontier. And we have a photograph here with a caption that says, "A Cherokee Chief." During the 1740s, groups of settlers began to move into the area between the Appalachian Mountains and the Atlantic coastal plain. This area was known as the back country. Land in the back country costs much less money than land on the Atlantic coastal plain. Most of these settlers came from Ireland, Scotland, and Germany. Families in the back country built log cabins and cleared areas in the forest to grow corn and wheat. Life was hard, but people still managed to have fun. Like other colonists, they held dances, quilting contests, and other competitions. The Yamasee War. Many Native Americans also lived in the backcountry. The Yamasee were originally friends of the Carolina colonists. The Yamasee complained when colonists began taking too much land and breaking their promises. In 1715, the Yamasee, with their allies, the Muskogee and Choctaw, attacked the colonists, causing many settlers to flee to other colonies. The Cherokee, however, agreed to help the colonists in exchange for weapons and other goods. The Yamasee lost the war and fled to Florida. So Florida is south of South Carolina. So they left the Carolinas, this group of Native Americans, and moved further south down into Florida. The Cherokee then became the most powerful Native American group in the Carolinas. So boys and girls, I believe right now you're going to have a discussion question about indentured servants or about the life, colonial life for boys and girls. If you need to look back in your textbook, then please do that and make sure you're answering your questions in complete sentences. Thank you, boys and girls.